Welcome to our next installment in the video lecture series for the American Economic History course online here at Rutgers University. And to this point, we've gone through the colonial period of North America, and now we're moving into the period where the United States is a newly formed nation. And we're going to take a look at the issues related to that switch from being a colonial entity, being part of the British Empire, being under the terms of the mercantilist system, and moving away from those to the issues of this is a sovereign nation and what economic problems come about from this switch from a colonial entity to a sovereign nation. So I want you to realize that as a backdrop to this. That's the point we've gotten to, from a colonial entity to a sovereign nation. So the things I really want you to stress when you do your readings in the textbook is, number one, understand that initially we were under the Articles of Confederation and that we moved to a constitution from that. So the question that begs to be answered is, why did we go from the Articles of Confederation to the Constitution? So obviously, what were the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation? So make sure when you're doing your readings that you look at anything that relates to the weaknesses, and make sure you have a very good understanding of what the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation were. And then finally, since we switched to the Constitution, how the Constitution addressed the weaknesses. So you want to understand what the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation are. But you want to know how the Constitution addressed these weaknesses. Number one. Secondly, we want to take a look at the economic aspects of the Constitution. Particularly, it's a legal structure for the United States, but it's also a legal structure for doing business. It's a legal structure for economic activity. So we're going to take a look at some of the economic aspects of the Constitution. We won't look at all of the Constitution, but the elements that have a clear economic interpretation will be our concern. And then finally, as an independent nation, we have at the disposal of the government the public domain, land that was the property of the federal government, and how they disposed of that land. So I want you to be aware of that was a resource that was in great supply, land. Completely different from the situation in Europe. In Europe, there was a shortage of land. Another thing that occurred, that private ownership of land was very rare. The king or the queen or the sovereign owned land. And even if the king or queen gave you land, the king or queen could take that land back from you for whatever reason. Since the king was sovereign and what they said went, you couldn't really complain about it. Because if you complained about it, well, the king or queen might have your head taken off, very simply. So realize that the impact of the availability of land, the fact that the federal government had all of this land, and how the federal government was going to dispose of this land, particularly the transfer of publicly held land to privately held land and the rules associated with that. So I want you to be aware of that, the importance of the fact that there was an abundance of land, that the federal government owned this land, and that there was a transfer of this publicly held land to private individuals. So that transfer, the mechanism for that transfer, but also the notion of the property rights, of the individual being able to own that land, and the implications for economic activity and how that impacted the development of the economy in the United States. So when you're reading through that, make sure that you underline or you understand a couple of things that are very important. That the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation were many. Number one, that there was a weak national government and had a very limited ability to tax. So we think of the Articles of Confederation as having a central government, but a weak central government. The reason for this is that in the newly formed country, one of the reasons that the colonies revolted against Great Britain was because of the fact that they had a strong central government and that the colonies themselves felt like their power was undermined by that strong federal government, that strong centralized government. So it only is natural that individuals who are leery of centralized power, when they were going to get together and form a new nation, that central authority would be very limited. So remember that those are the weaknesses, that the national government was a weak national government and that it lacked taxing power. Now some people might think that that's a good thing, but when you have debt that you have to deal with, remember, we fought a war of independence, and we borrowed money. Both the Continental Congress borrowed money, and the individual colonies that became states borrowed money. So the ability of government to pay that debt off was very important. The issue with taxing is that the states, there wasn't any taxing. The states basically had to contribute money to the national government. And it was a willful contribution that the the national government would send to the state a wish and say, give us $1 million or whatever that amount happened to be. And if the state wanted to give the money to them, they'd give the money to them. If the state didn't want to give money to the national government, they didn't give money to the national government. So the national government was built on a precarious financial position of having very limited revenues. All right? So make sure you realize that was a major issue, that we were in debt and we had no means of raising money to settle that debt. It's very important because it's something we're going to learn about how the financial institutions of this country developed. And going back from 1791, etc., there are very rare instances of the federal government defaulting on its loan payments. Very rarely has this occurred. I want to say it's never occurred, but it has occurred on very, very rare occasions. So you can imagine, for example, where you have payments. You have to pay your credit card, loan payments, maybe a mortgage, whatever you have to pay. And being 200 years old, having only 2 or 3 instances where you were late with a payment. It's pretty impressive. You never forget. You never accidentally forget to mail the check. The check's in the mail, etc. So realize that the federal government over the entire time period that we're talking about in the United States has always pretty much paid its debts on time. So that's an important thing. Well, realize under the Articles of Confederation, we couldn't pay our debts. As a matter of fact, we couldn't even make our interest payments. National debt was increasing not by spending, but by the fact that we were paying interest on interest because we weren't making interest payments. So realize that. When I talk about that taxing power and the fact that the states didn't have to, they voluntarily contributed money to the centralized government, leads to the free rider problem. And make sure you realize and remember what the free rider problem is. The free rider problem has to do with communal benefits. There was no incentive for the states themselves to give money to the federal government. Now, the example I give you with the free rider problem is I'm sure that you've all been involved in a group project. And there's always, if you have a number of people working on a project, the amount of work done by individuals varies quite a bit because there's always somebody involved in that project who doesn't do the amount of work that they're supposed to do. The reason why is that there's a free rider problem. They realize that there are some people who are involved in the project who are very concerned about their grade and will do extra work, i.e. do the work that one individual doesn't do and pick up that extra work in order to get that higher grade. Same thing happened with the states and the national government under the Articles of Confederation. Same principle holds with, for example, public television. All of us probably watched public television at some point in time in our lives. How many of us have actually contributed to public television? I can tell you right now, I'm getting older. I've watched quite a bit of public television. I have never once given money to public television. I am a free rider because other people support public television. I don't send them any money, even though I enjoy their programming. So realize that the free rider problem existed with the colonies. With the newly constituted states under the Articles of Confederation. Also, realize that with this debt, there was also an inflationary period that with the Continental Congress printed something called a Continental that they printed so much of became almost worthless. I think 1/1000th of its value over a 10-year time period. Be the equivalent, for example, if a soda cost you $2 at the student center, 10 years later you come back to the student center and that same soda cost you $2,000. That's the level of inflation that was existing during this time period. Another weakness, and make sure you're aware of this weakness, is the fact that states could regulate interstate trade amongst themselves. States could ban products from coming into their state, could impose tariffs. For example, New Jersey back then could have placed a tariff on goods coming in from Pennsylvania or New York. So the national government could not regulate interstate trade. The states could regulate interstate trade. Very much limits the markets that could develop in the young nation. So realize that as a weakness. The fact that a national marketplace could not develop because each individual state could regulate interstate trade, set up tariff barriers or non-tariff barriers, etc., to trade. Also, there was no comprehensive international trade policy under the Articles of Confederation. The states themselves were in charge of negotiating international trade with other nations. So you have 13 states with 13 individual international trade policies instead of one unified international trade policy covering the entire United States. Also realize that there were national defense issues. You couldn't raise the money, you couldn't come up with an army, or more importantly, a navy. How are you going to protect your maritime fleet and international trade from piracy? Piracy was a big issue back then. How could you prevent other nations from just taking your goods or your ships that are on the high seas? You need a national navy in order to protect your maritime fleet. So if you can't raise the money, you can't raise the maritime fleet. If you don't have the maritime fleet, you can't protect your international trade routes. Another weakness under the Articles of Confederation. Also, the fact there was a lack of a national judiciary. And basically, the importance of this is that if there were legal disputes between individuals in different states, the outcome would vary by where that trial was actually held. If a New Jersey person was upset with a merchant in Pennsylvania, if he sued them in New Jersey court, they would likely win. If they tried to sue them in Pennsylvania court, they would likely lose because the judiciary generally sided with individuals within their own state. So there was no uniformity of rules going across different states. So realize that with the Articles of Confederation, the fact that there were so many weaknesses with this, that gives you an indication of why we got rid of the United States. The United States got rid of the Articles of Confederation and moved on to the Constitution. So make sure you realize that those main issues. What were the problems? The fact that we had debt that we could not repay, and that's tied to the taxes. All right? We had no power to tax. Therefore, we couldn't handle the debt. And without handling the debt, how are we going to borrow money in the future if we are basically deadbeats? We don't pay our bills and we don't pay back the money that we borrow. We'll be a poor credit risk, and if our government's a poor credit risk, that means the merchants working within that nation are a poor credit risk. Problems where the states themselves could regulate international trade. They could have raised tariffs. New Jersey could place a tariff on items coming in from Pennsylvania, and then Pennsylvania would react by placing a tariff on New Jersey items. So you'd end up having a tariff battle or a tariff war. And finally, military weakness. And the importance of this is, how are you going to maintain a maritime presence in a world where international trade goes over the seas? If you can't maintain a navy to protect those trade routes, you cannot engage in international trade. The Constitution, how did this fix all these issues? Federal taxation gave the United States federal government a definable resource. It allowed a revenue stream to come into the federal government. Why is that important? Because it allowed us to pay back our debts. So we had a revenue stream to pay back the money we owed, but it also showed other people, individuals who might be unwilling to lend to the United States or merchants in the United States, that if the federal government had a revenue stream, that it would be possible to borrow in the future. So bringing in this revenue stream was very important, and it allowed us to pay off what we had already borrowed, but it laid the basis of having revenues for future borrowing. The fact that regulation of trade, both interstate and international, that under the Constitution the states could not regulate interstate trade, it was only the federal government's domain. So the fact that we did not have, for example, 13 individual markets, but in essence had a unified market that was the size of those 13 states. So that gives benefits to the United States by having a national, almost free trade zone. All right, obviously restricted by cost of transportation, etc., but this allows a national marketplace to develop. And finally, the money supply. There was issues related to how the money supply was going to be controlled, so monetary issues are addressed in the Constitution. Also, a post office. You might not think that's important nowadays. The post office is in trouble as revenues go down, as alternate forms of communication supplant the mail. But back then, that was the way that information flowed. You have to realize that nowadays, we take for granted that we could send an email across the world instantaneously, and information is within our grasp very easily. Back then, information flow was much slower, and having a post office sped that up. It allowed for information to flow within the country, and that helped to unify the markets that were developing in the United States. Also realize that the Constitution addressed patent and copyright laws. Patent laws for inventions and copyright laws for intellectual property. So this is important because if you allow somebody a patent, and a patent gives you a monopoly on your creation, it has a stimulative effect on innovation. Because if you think about it, if you we're going to spend research and development time and money to develop a new or come up with a new invention, if you could not benefit financially from that invention, if you invented this new process or a new item that's going to revolutionize computers and change the way computers are used, or it doesn't even matter, a new product. If you come up with that and anybody can produce it and sell it, what's the point in innovating when you can't get the monetary gains from that? Same thing with copyright laws, for example, film, print media, songs, etc. Why would anybody create songs if they can't benefit monetarily from that, and anybody could make money off of it? So this is important for innovation, that this protects the innovator from other people benefiting from the innovation that they create. And finally, realize the Constitution allowed the ability to raise and support armies. And this is important, for example, with the settling of Western lands and dealing with the Native American population. I'll say dealing with the Native American population. It's probably not a good way of putting it. But taking the land from the Native American population is one way to look at it. But also a navy. So if you have a navy, you can protect your ships from piracy. You can protect your ships from foreign nations just taking your ships and taking the product and the people on those ships. So realize that when I talk about the National Free Trade Zone, make sure you realize this notion of regional specialization. That when you have a national free trade zone, what will end up happening? Each area will produce what it has, what it can produce at the lowest opportunity cost. So whatever your region, the comparative advantage your region has, that is what you will produce. You will produce the item that you can produce at the lowest opportunity cost. So by limiting the ability of the states to regulate interstate trade, you allow for regional specialization to occur and the benefits from regional specialization. So we end up seeing the North being more of a manufacturing region, the Midwest being a farming region, and the South being mainly, before the Civil War, a cotton growing region, and those type of staple products. That it allows those regions to produce what they're the most efficient at producing. And also, we have a comprehensive international trade policy. So we can give subsidies or tariffs. A tariff is a tax on imports. A subsidy is the federal government actually paying individuals to produce an item. So instead of having 13 distinct trade policies, we have one unified trade policy, so we can more efficiently negotiate with foreign countries. If the 13 separate states negotiate independent trade policies versus having a unified trade policy, the unified trade policy is going to have much more impact on foreign nations. Realize this individual's name, Charles Beard, that he took a look at the Constitution, and he looked one of the first people to look at it as a document of economic self-interest. So it was not just a political and an ideological document, but it was a document that was created as partly from the economic self-interest of the individuals who created it. All right, and he says merchants, moneylenders, security holders, manufacturers, shippers, capitalists, and financiers supported the document. So he's looking at a economic class of individuals who supported the Constitution. Generally business interests, merchants, banks, moneylenders, anybody who held government securities. Obviously, the government can't pay you and it owes you money. Individuals who hold those debts will want to get paid, so they're going to be for a constitution that allows for taxation so they can get paid. Manufacturers, shippers, etc., financiers. So his argument is that the economic interests of a merchant, the merchant class or business people, supported it. Farmers were against it, and he posits that debtors were both against it. All right, farmers were against the notion of having a strong central government. In essence, pretty much through the entire history of the United States, farmers are generally opposed to strong centralized controls. All right, so people who are owed money were for this, but debtors were opposed to this. The reason why debtors were opposed to this is the inflation issue. If you owe money and it's inflation, and there's an inflationary period, the money you pay back is lower in value. So you're paying a smaller portion of your income in the form of the debt that you owe. For example, if you have a fixed interest payment of $1,000 a month, that means you owe $1,000 a month till the end of that mortgage. That does not change. Your taxes and your insurance might change, but the other things do not change. All right? If you hold that house in an inflationary period, as inflation goes up, your wages go up. So your wages continue to increase if they keep pace with inflation, but that debt payment stays constant. So in an inflationary period, debtors are paying back what they owe in depreciated money. That debt becomes a smaller and smaller portion of their income. So debtors are generally pro-inflation. So anything in the Constitution that had elements of stabilizing prices, debtors would be opposed to. All right, I already went over those. One individual, remember this Forrest MacDonald, because he was one of the first people to quantify the voting behavior of individuals who voted on the Constitution and their economic interests. And he talks about anybody wishing to rewrite history of these proceedings largely or exclusively in the terms of economic interest represented there would find there to be insurmountable obstacles. So he is a little bit running contrary to the way Beard takes a look at the Constitution. So I would remember this individual's name as being contrary to the thoughts of Beard. In particular, let's remember these two individuals, McGuire and Osfelt. They do some very fancy econometric modeling on the voting pattern of McGuire and Osfelt. They look at the data and they reappraise MacDonald and they take a look at Beard. And what they did is, as I said, they ran econometric models to try and predict how individuals voted, and they find that delegates voted in a manner consistent with their economic interest. And I got to change there, that's not spelled correctly. So basically, they substantiate Beard and sort of undercut MacDonald. They say that when they do actual econometric modeling on voting patterns, they see patterns that are consistent with economic self-interest. All right? They looked at and controlled for people's occupation. So I want you to remember what types of predictive factors that McGuire and Osfelt used in their econometric model on that tried to predict voting patterns on the Constitution. So they included controls for the occupation of the voter, whether or not they owned slaves, whether or not they were involved in land speculation, how much debt they had. How much debt they had, but whether or not they were owed money. So they looked at people who were lenders versus debtors. So their debtor status, were they the lenders or were they the people who had to pay money back? So they looked at their occupation as an economic factor, slave ownership, if they owned slaves, and probably they also looked at the amount of slaves that individuals held. If they had large slave holdings, how that impacted their voting pattern, whether or not they were involved in land speculation, the debt, if they were owed money by the federal government, or whether or not they actually owed money. All right, so what were their results? If you were from a coastal area or large state, you favored the increased federal power. If you were an individual from a slave-owning state, so if you were a delegate from a state that was reliant on slave labor, you actually favored states' rights. So the slavery issue, even when we talk about the Civil War, they talk about as a states' rights issue. If you take a look at the Constitution, individuals who voted against the Constitution were more likely to be from slave-owning states. All right, or individuals representing slave owners, if they were slave owners or from states that were particularly reliant on slavery, they were against the Constitution. If you were a merchant interest, all right, or if you were the owner of Western lands, or if you held public debt. If you held public debt, I told you this one previously. If you were owed money, you would want a strong federal government because they would be able to raise revenues in order to pay you back. If you were in debt, if you were a debtor, they found significant results that you were more likely to vote against the Constitution. So realize that there seems to be a consistent amount of evidence that the individuals who voted on the Constitution consistently voted in their own economic vested interest. Now that we've finished that, let's take a look at land policy. And this is important, as I said previously, to understand economic development, because this is a resource that there was a surplus of. The federal government had a lot of land. So there's this public domain. What are we going to do with the public domain? How are we going to transfer it to private individuals? And what are going to be the rules for that transfer? And what are going to be the laws related to personal property ownership? So realize that the federal government had quite a bit of this community property, and what they needed to do was to transfer that with individuals. Realize the importance of private property ownership is this notion of the tragedy of the commons. And I want you to realize what the tragedy of the commons is. Let me give you a little example, and let me give you sort of a definition of the tragedy of the commons. The example I oftentimes give is, if you have public land, and particularly in Europe, they had public land that people could use, for example, to graze their sheep. So you could have sheep near the public land and take your sheep or your cattle or whatever and to graze on the public land. The problem with that common land is that it has a tendency to be overused, right? If there are multiple people who want to graze their sheep or their cattle on their land, if somebody sends their sheep out on that land or their cattle on that land and they eat up all the grass, there's no grass left for other individuals after that cattle or that sheep has grazed. So that's what it means by the tragedy of the commons. There's an incentive for people to get to that property first and to use up that resource before other people get to use that resource. So the tragedy of the commons is related to the overutilization of public land or public goods. All right? So remember that. That's an important concept of public land and the overuse of public land. If you allow public grazing, people will overgraze the land because they are allowed to use it for free, no cost. And if they wait to use the land, there might not be any benefit from their sheep or their cattle being on grazing that land. Two important ordinances. Make sure when you read through this, I go through this, but I noticed there were multiple questions, multiple choice questions and true and false questions about the land ordinances. The importance of the land ordinances is, number one, that this was a good source of federal revenue. Remember, this land was owned by the federal government, so if the government transferred that land to you, you paid the federal government money, so it was a source of revenue for the federal government. All right? And it was important to transfer that property and it's the security and the ownership of that property to a private owner. Make sure you realize a couple of these tenets right here. That when you bought the land from the federal government, it was your land. There was no conditions placed that the federal government could take that land back from you. Now, we'll talk about eminent domain later on. We realize that it's not, the tenure is not complete. If the federal government decides to use eminent domain, that land can be taken from you accordingly. But just realize that once that transfer exists, it's your land. As long as you maintain that land and you meet all the requirements of holding that land, i.e. paying your taxes, etc., it's your land and you can do with that land with what you want. Remember, this is different than what occurred in Europe. In Europe, the king could give you land or the queen could give you land or whoever the sovereign happened to be, and if they changed their mind at a later date, they could just take it back from you. So realize that that's an important component of land ownership, that transfer is final as long as you maintain that land or the requirements of holding that land, i.e. paying your taxes. All right. The other thing that the land ordinances did was it allowed for an orderly distribution. And it set up a system for the transfer of that federal land into private hands. And it also set up a system to make sure that the land was surveyed, to make sure that the land was broken up appropriately and that there was not going to be, for example, two people laying claim to the same exact land. It was the federal government's land to survey the land, to lay it out and map it out and say, for example, if I bought land, my land went from point A to point B to point C to point D, And that's all the land between those 4 points is my land. There's no chance of another individual coming in and saying, well, no, you don't own that portion of land, I do. So it's by surveying the land, it broke the land up into different plots and allowed for the orderly distribution. And then the land ordinances also allowed for statehood in the future. If these lands got settled, at some point they were going to want to join the Union of the United States. Well, what was the criteria for those states, for those territories, to switch from territories to statehood and being part of the United States? All right, realize also during this time period that a degree of speculation occurred in land. There was quite a bit of land speculation to occur. People, just like today with housing speculation or speculation in securities or whatever, land speculation was an activity that occurred with a degree of frequency during this time period. And the reason why the speculation occurred is that even though the federal government set up a system to disperse the land to individuals, it took a long time. It was very slow in getting started up. They had to get the system set up in place. They had to have the administration. They had to have the land surveyed, etc. All right, the grants had the recording of titles, the granting of titles, etc. Took a very long time. All right, also the prices that were charged for the land. The thing is, the federal government didn't recognize that the quality of land varied. They just had one price for all land. So, for example, if you got 40 acres of land in the middle of a desert, it cost the same as 40 acres of prime farming land in the Midwest. They did not recognize that land prices varied depending on the productivity of the land. So as I said, you could get land that you could grow absolutely nothing in the middle of Death Valley. It cost the same per acre as land that was farming land right alongside the Mississippi River, so your transportation costs and shipping costs were much lower. So the reservation prices that the federal government was charging for some lands was too high, and it was way too low for other lands. So just realize that. All right, realize that how they broke up these parcel sizes. Minimum 640 acres of land at $1 an acre. Now you might say that's nothing today. Well, back then $640 was a lot of money. All right, so here you had to come up with $640 in order to buy 640 acres of land. 640 acres minimum at $1 an acre. So you can see how this would limit the transfer of lands because a lot of individuals could not afford that. This would probably be equivalent to 5 to 10 years worth of income for an individual. All right, so realize that the acreage minimums were too high, that people just could not afford to purchase these. They realized that the acreage minimum was too high, so you had to pay cash. You had to pay gold and silver to get this acreage. Credit terms were introduced in 1796. They realized that we can't get rid of this land. It's too expensive. People can't afford to buy the land. That only wealthy individuals can afford to buy land. We will actually sell land on credit, which eased the burden of buying land, but then they increased the price to $2 an acre. So you can see that here in one instance, they try to ease the burden of purchasing land by lending providing credit to individuals to purchase land, but then they doubled the price of land. So I want you to realize how difficult it was for individuals to purchase the land. You had to buy 640 acres of land at $1 an acre, so you had to come up with $640 worth of gold in order to do this. The sales were slow, so the federal government institutes credit terms to ease that up, but then they double the price of land. Finally, they lower the acreage minimums to 320 acres in 1800, and you can see successively they lower those acreages, the minimum acreages, from 320 to 160 to 80 to 40. So I want you to realize that when they started dispersing this land, the minimum acreages that they would sell were too high. It was just not feasible for most individuals to purchase land, particularly the fact that it lacked credit, but after that they lowered the minimum acreages until it finally got to 40 acres in 1832. Realize that there were some issues here. This notion of preemption. The modern word for preemption is squatting. All right? If you use property that you do not own, that is considered squatting. So if you use vacant property and live there, you are a squatter. The term back in the 1790s and 1800s was preemption. You were using that federal land that you didn't own. So realize that this notion of squatting, preemption, existed in the 1790s and in the early 1800s. Individuals would go out and settle land and never purchase it and use that particular land. State governments were generally sided with squatters, mostly because it increased the population. All right. Also, if it was a territory, if you were trying to get statehood, the greater your population, the closer you were to meeting that population threshold to be admitted as a state in the Union. So if you allowed squatting, you allowed individuals to increase your population. So state governments generally kind of cast a blind eye at squatting because it was in their best interest for population and development to occur. The federal government, well, didn't look so kindly on the issue of squatting and preemption. All right, that's it. Next, coming up, we will have the lecture for Chapter 6.